Thank you, Senator Roth. Senator Monning.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to thank the administration and the LAO for helping shed light and respond to some of our questions. I think I've got kind of a big picture question. I think Ms. Bosler referred to it in your opening statement, but the forecast of the loss of Prop 30 revenues, and how does that factor into our long-range planning and some of the projected budget forecasts? Do they include that loss of revenue? And I'd also be just curious the LAO's response to that. And then, assuming there is attention given to that, is there any commensurate conversation or discussion about supplanting those revenues, and if so, how? Or just getting by without those revenues when they expire?
So our multi-year forecast does reflect that the Proposition 30 that does have the triggers they stagger. The sales tax goes off first, and then the income tax provisions at the end of 2018. The budget year is the last year in our multi-year forecast where the full effect of Proposition 30 is felt. Right now, Proposition 30 is valued at about $8 billion. And the sales tax will trigger off at the end of 2016, and the personal income tax increases will trigger off at the end of 2018. And so over the forecast period, we do project revenue growth, but the reduction in the tax rates is also reflected. But that's really the main factor that is contributing to the budget really being balanced only precariously over the forecast period, because we also are going to be facing some increased costs in some programs, most notably Medi-Cal, but other programs as well.
Thank you. And LAO on that question?
Just to add a couple of things, Senator. The measure, Prop 30, was devised so that you do phase down more gradually over 4 fiscal years, so you don't have this huge cliff effect. In our forecasts, which are not that much different from the finances, we assume if the recovery continues over the forecast period, you're going to have growth in revenues of about 2 to 3% in those last couple of years because of the personal income tax rates triggering off. So obviously that's not the kind of growth you would normally expect during a regular year, but it's not as if you have a decline in revenue from year to year, again, assuming that the recovery continues.
Thank you. And then maybe back to the administration on that question. The second part of my question was if there's any other planning for supplementing that lost revenue, or is it just anticipating continued growth in the state's economy as a result of commerce and stock market? And, I mean, if we don't enjoy continued economic growth as a state, is there any conversation about how we might buttress and protect that against that loss of revenue?
At this point, our budget is built on Proposition 30 triggering off as intended when it was passed by the voters. And so, no, we're really building a budget that is balanced over the long term with the Proposition 30 revenues going away.
Thank you. And LAO, do you think there's any need to, can we just rely on the growth of our economy to help fill in that loss?
Hard to say, Senator. I mean, it gets down to a basic judgment about the overall spending level and the needs as you perceive them. So it's a little hard for a staff person to make that judgment.
Okay, and again, I think that's kind of a macro question, but I think a lot of our assumptions moving forward assume maybe best case scenario in terms of our growth and recovery, which I think you've both cautioned is fragile. Just another question now focused in on Health and Human Services. I know my colleague and chair of Sub 3, Senator Mitchell, will have some questions in this area as well, but I think in some just general reactions to the overall budget, education, a big winner, some of that required, of course, as a function of Prop 98. But if there's any shortcomings, it seems to be felt once again in the area of health and human services. And I know we'll be having full hearings on these in sub 3, but with respect to developmental services, and there's several subcategories there, of course, but with the big push to close the big centers and go to community-based support for the developmentally disabled, there's been no increase in the rates received by providers since 2006, yet we've had increase in minimum wage and other just cost inflators. And in the district I represent, and I know I'm not alone, some of the providers who have provided care for very high need residents in the homes, they're closing the homes because they just can no longer run a business. And while there have been studies initiated, I think, by Health and Human Services Agency, they're studying while these homes are closing. And for the families who are dependent, it's not like there's an open market of competition of providers. To the contrary, the need is growing and the provider base is shrinking. So I'm just curious from both the administration and the LAO, and again, I'm picking on a particular area, but it's one that I know in my district we've received a lot of concern, and it's not a new concern. It seems every budget cycle, this community is frozen at 2006 rate levels, and we do have something called the Lanterman Act that is supposed to be a civil rights act and protection for the developmentally disabled, and that's often the community. They have some wonderful advocates, but they're often outnumbered and outflanked by interest groups with much larger advocacy budgets. So if we here in this committee are not advocates for this community, they will continue to be underfunded and at the end of the line. So I show my interest here, but I'm just curious, any reassurances that you can offer as to whether the proposed increases, what are they based upon? Is it based on this growth in the community, and does it contemplate any increase in provider rate reimbursement?
Teresa Calvert with Department of Finance. The growth in the Department of Developmental Services budget is largely attributable to caseload and utilization increases. There's no provider rate increase built in except for adjustments related to minimum wage and sick leave. The HHS agency, as you noted, is working on a developmental services task force, and one of the work groups that they have already initiated is focused on rates and rate structures, and they'll also be looking at regional center operations as they move forward. So those are efforts in that area.
Thank you. LAO, any?
Sean Martin with the Legislative Analyst Office. Just one additional observation is that when we were reducing regional center budgets over the past 5-6 years due to the recession, one of the responsibilities that we relieved some of the providers of was providing us with information about their costs. So since they did not report that information for several years, there's a lack of data for us to turn around and look at what their costs are, how they might have increased, and evaluate from that perspective whether rate increases are justified.
Great. Well, I appreciate that. And again, we'll drill down more in our sub 3, but I think this is a shared concern of the legislature, if I may be so bold. I don't think this is a partisan issue. There's not a Senate district or Assembly district in this state that doesn't have tax-paying families who have the challenge of developmentally disabled family members. So it's going to be a priority for me, and I think for many other members. And I just think any studies, we should have the ambition of collecting whatever data is available between now and the May revise, so that we can have some informed data to generate a counter proposal to the administration, or hopefully that the administration would include in its May revise, because again, I think the status quo is not only potentially a violation of protected legal rights, there's a human rights issue here as well. So I appreciate any help from the administration and the LAO's office in putting a microscope on this. So thank you.
Thank you, Senator Monning. And I very much appreciate your bringing up the issue. I had it on my list of follow-up questions. I hear often from our regional center, and these are folks doing the Lord's work, and they're doing it on less than a shoestring budget at this point. Their costs, of course, have gone up since 2006. You say there are caseload adjustments, but that is correct.
That is correct. Caseload and utilization, both.
Nonetheless, the challenge of operating on a shoestring budget is only exacerbated as the size of the population they're dealing with, even for adjustments for caseload. But we know rates of autism are going up. And then there's also the phenomenon of younger beneficiaries of the services provided by regional centers who are now adults and create additional and greater challenges for us. So I would agree with you. We have to get some information so that we can make informed choices based on data, but I think I'd be prepared to make decisions based on the anecdotal information I have at this point, because there's no doubt that the need is so great. So thank you, Senator Monty. Senator Allen, thank you for your patience.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for this very informative hearing and for these great reports. A couple of things I wanted to ask about. First of all, I very much share some of Senator Roth's concerns about judicial funding and also its potential impact on districts as they relate to this reserve requirement. Now, I've heard different reports about what exactly this district reserve change means. So I'd just love a little bit of clarification as to when the reserve limit kicks in and under what circumstances under the current set of rules.
Sure. So there's sort of a matrix of requirements that need to be met. First of all, at the most basic level, so there needs to be a deposit made, or a requirement to make a deposit into the reserve and to the Prop 98 reserve. And the requirements for that are, linked to the increase in capital gains, to, the Proposition 98 share of that increase in the capital gains, the amount of that increase that is above what we'd call sort of an ongoing, expense of education. So we factor in a COLA, growth in ADA funding. So if there's sufficient money, growth in Proposition 98 to fund all that, and then there's some additional money that can be attributable to capital gains, then, the other factor is if there's a maintenance factor that's outstanding. So, currently if there's the existing maintenance factor has to be paid off, and the maintenance factor makes up for reductions that were made in Proposition 98 in prior years. Currently, we've got about $2 billion in maintenance factor. Even after the significant increases this year, we still have significant maintenance factor left. So all that has to be paid off. And then even when that's paid off, if there's any more maintenance factor is generated, whatever the required maintenance factor payment, that must be made also before a deposit can be put into the reserve. And then once you've met all those requirements and a deposit's placed in the reserve, then the restriction on school district reserves would apply. So there's a very complicated set of requirements that would need to come into play. It's really, we're only talking about, probably, at least a couple of years from now, from when this is even a possibility, and then it would have to be a pretty significant spike in revenues to generate this, generate a deposit into the Prop 98 reserve and trigger the spending the district reserve requirements.
Okay. So there's not it's purely based on this formula. It's not, there's no, is there a particular year before which it cannot kick in? Or is it, or when people say it can only come in within a few years, it's because it'll take us a while to get to the set of factors you just described?
Yes, that's right. It's purely based on the formula.
Okay. My other question is on the slides here, we've got a slide saying that we've got $1 billion for California community colleges. I'm looking at page 21 of the LAO's report, and it's looking like, at least from 2014-15, it was $424 million increase to community colleges. And I'm just trying to get a better understanding of that disparity. Was this supposed to mean $1 billion total for higher ed, or?
No. So that's, I don't have the LAO's page in front of me, but I'm assuming that's the budget year component. And so when we updated all of the numbers for the January 10 budget, when you update Proposition 98, it also drives additional expenditures in the current year and even the prior year, depending on the revenues. So the total over the 3-year period is $1 billion in new resources to the community colleges.
Now, and that's ongoing?
Some of it is one time, and some of it is ongoing.
Okay.
And I don't have those numbers right in front of me right now about the split.
I guess we'll get into that at sub 1. Okay, that's helpful. Now, so I suppose with that in mind, and obviously in the context of this conversation we're having about all this new money that's required in corrections and elsewhere, I just wanted to get a better sense of Mr. Taylor's comments about the University of California and the need for the university to justify these cost increases and ask, the extent to which that we should be asking students to pay for these increases when, essentially the increases associated with the University of California's budget are actually arguably under the cost of living over the last year, and particularly dramatic in the context of the fact that, we're now spending less than half per pupil for, if you correct for inflation, than we were back in 1990 for the University of California, certainly about half of what the University of California share of the state budget used to be back in 1990. So I wanted to get a better sense of what you're trying to say with regards to the extent to which the university needs to justify these cost increases when there's lots of other increases going on in other parts of the budget, and the university is ultimately receiving much less of an increase vis-a-vis other programs.
Well, remember, that's a case where you have to look at all of their funding sources. That we have dropped our general fund, there's no question about it. The share of the general fund budget going to higher ed is much lower. But tuition and general fund are in fact fungible. They're both used to pay for your instructional program. So if you look at what the university has now per student, what they had before the recession, I'm not sure it's that much different. That is, we have provided funds for them. We've just done it with a different mix. So you really have to look at both funding sources to look at their programmatic funding, not just their general fund.
It's not much different because there's been such they've increased the tuition so much?
That's correct. We relied more on tuition. We had extremely low fees at UC. Now we have still relatively low, but they're closer to, say, an average of what might be paid at other public institutions around the country.
Right. I guess I had, I suppose, I'm not sure if I sensed an assumption in your comments that suggested that whatever increases that may be needed for the increased costs, we've got to turn to the students to see if they're...
No. If I wasn't clear about the center, I apologize. If you went to a share of costs, what it would say is as costs go up, the relative shares will go up proportionally. So that if students are bearing a third of the cost, and UC can justify that costs go up 4%, they need 4%, tuition will go up 4%, the state's general fund share on its 2/3 would go up 4%. But both parties would be putting pressure on the system to justify why is it that you need costs to go up. It may be perfectly valid.
Right.
They may need to go up by 4 or 5% to pay for some of their unfunded obligations or because you want to expand services or get more people through the system. But that's where the focus should be.
Well, of course, costs tend to go up for everyone around 3-4% just because of inflation and everything else.
Jennifer Kuhn, ledge analyst. Our understanding, the UC budget has become quite interesting because on the one hand, the governor is expressing concern about their costs per degree, their cost per completion, their cost per student, and at the same time providing some money for their costs to go up without enrollment growth. So it's just even higher spending per degree, higher spending per student. So I think this is just trying to foster a conversation. Let's be comfortable as a state, as a university, that whatever costs are generated are important enough that folks are willing to share in the funding of them. And again, it's just within this broader context of if there is a concern with costs that you see, let's sort of try to address it coherently as opposed to sort of piecemeal.
Right. I guess all I would say is, and I know so many incredibly important programs have suffered tremendously, and so this is certainly not something that's unique to the UC. But if you look at where the UC was in terms of the state's investment and the amount they were spending per student back 20 years ago, 30 years ago, certainly 40 years ago versus now, it's extraordinary how far we've slipped in this investment. And it just seems concerning to me, I suppose, that the tenor of some of the conversation that seems to be going around about the UC's, about the state's kind of long-term investment in the UC and an understanding about the costs associated with high-quality, accessible public higher education. Now, I understand this one-on-one committee is going to be a very interesting one, and I certainly am just as interested with Senator Block in what's going to come out of it. And I think the two governors are very smart, extraordinarily financially and politically savvy people, and I just hope that they'll be able to come up with something that really does preserve the integrity of the university. It's been such an important investment for this state.
Thank you, Senator Allen. Senator Pan.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator Leno. First, just a couple questions about sort of more the revenue side, and then I want to drill in on some of the spending side. So first of all, I guess, and I know that Senator Block touched on this. You think about when we think about where California is in per pupil spending, and I had a little debate about that. We think about the fact that we are essentially at the bottom, or certainly in the bottom 2 or 3 in Medi-Cal, and those are like the 2 biggest things we spend money on. And yet people will say that we're a high tax state and so forth. So where's the money going? Our 2 biggest programs are at the bottom of the country. So while we're looking at it, and certainly it's great that we have an increase, we have a recent increase in money, and we did talk a little bit about corrections where we're much more than other states. I mean, I guess if it's just the taxpayer just a little frustrated that why are we, so underfunding when, and where's the money going? And I guess that's. Okay, but maybe I'll leave that as rhetorical then. And we'll drill into this later on. And then I guess the second thing is that because we touched on tax expenditures, so I may appreciate, and I know that we're mainly going to be talking about general fund in this committee. We do have this, table and the little graph that shows our expenditures. Perhaps we ought to have one that actually includes tax expenditures. So instead of talking about education being 29.3%. We throw in the other $50 billion there. Then we start seeing where we're really spending our priorities on. And, we have a healthy debate about it. You're right. Probably some of those will never, that's what the public wants. We won't touch, but at least it's in there. It's in the pie chart. And I think we need to think about doing that, saying what's our baseline and where our tax expenditures fit into this larger context. We're not going to be voting on the tax expenditures in this committee and so forth, but I think it's helpful to look at the bigger picture and say, well, out of our baseline revenues, since we're talking about revenues, where are we spending the money? And some of it's because it's foregone revenue, some of it's because we're spending. But I think it'd be helpful just for context to have a diagram like that, because we certainly have one here. We have special funds, and we have bonds, and we have general fund, but. If we're seriously talking about that being part of how we prioritize and make decisions in the state, I hope that we can have that chart and diagram as well, because I think that's just helpful for us to think about how we're prioritizing our resources. So perhaps the LAO can do something like that for us.
Jason Cisney with the LAO. California actually was a leader among states in quantifying tax expenditures. We actually have 2 reports per year from the Franchise Tax Board, the tax agencies, as well as the Department of Finance that look at those. They are not displayed very prominently, as you pointed out, say, in some of the key budget summary documents. And we'll make sure that the members of the committee have a link to those. We'll send to your staffs and make sure you can access them. California has a significant amount of tax expenditures that have grown over time. As the legislative analyst was mentioning, among the largest is the mortgage interest deduction. So some of them are very popular programs.
And that's fine, and we'll probably continue those, but I think it's helpful to put it all in one chart. So what happens is because we separate it out, I wouldn't say it's outside, out of mind, but you don't see how that's reflected. And also, when we're doing projections out for many years, I realize there's always hazards in projections. What proportion, how are these growing or shrinking or so forth? I know that certainly for the governor's acknowledged that in his moves on whether it was in the various things, whether it was realignment and some other things, there were some pieces that they're probably looking at projections and from finances perspective, right? So how are some of these expenditures growing disproportionately, shrinking disproportionately? Who knows? It'd be just helpful to put all our expenditures in context. Let's put it that way. And then I want to touch on. I appreciate the interest in retiree employee health. And while I know there was a specific budgetary line on that's going to be talked about in collective bargaining as chair of the PERS committee, I hope that the administration will come and talk to us about the policy aspects of that. But I think also we need to look about health in this larger context. Clearly, you talked about Medi-Cal. We expanded Medi-Cal coverage. I think it was very important that we did that. But there are challenges in the Medi-Cal program, and unfortunately, I did not see that reflected in some of the priorities of budget. The state auditor's office came out with a report about dental care and the problems that DHCS is having with dental. And I don't see that being addressed here. Another situation that's happened is that I understand the governor's not proposing certainly any across-the-board rate increases, but we have identified areas where there are truly serious access problems. I think there's some general access problems, also some serious access problems. Certainly here in Sacramento, actually sort of overlaps a little with developmental centers, because when some of those patients need to have dental work, we were running some challenges about them finding a place to get their dental work done. And at least initially last year, we were told, well, there's some flexibility in the ability of the department when they identified these pockets of truly absent access, that they would have some flexibility to have monies to negotiate. And said, just find somebody. I don't want the state to pay any more than it has to for these services, all right? But if no one's willing to take what's being offered, then you're going to have to negotiate with somebody and find somebody who's willing to do it, and that there'll be some flexibility. But then later we were told by the department, no, the budget is the budget, and even if they can't find anybody, we will not pay a cent more. And to me, that's problematic, because if we're setting rates that are so low that no one will accept it, what's the use of the coverage? It's meaningless. So I hope that we can think about having some flexibility, at least at minimum, to be sure that we can keep the promise of Medi-Cal, that they should actually, that the department is able to try to negotiate to at least find some provider that's willing to take that. And I realize, we're rolling the managed care and so forth, and so a lot of times, but I mean, there has to be something something that's being done to be sure that we can that people can get access, and some.
Yes.
And I have more to follow up, but please, interest in your
Healthcare reform was a major, major undertaking, and the state, the Department of Healthcare Services, the Health and Human Services Agency, is really mired in all of those changes, and there's a lot going on, and there's
I like
a lot.
to use the word mired.
Sorry, mired is maybe not the right word. Sorry about that. So there is a lot going on right now. We're working on the 1115 waiver to the federal government. This is a massive, over $10 billion waiver And in that waiver, really trying to move the system of healthcare for our Medicaid population forward and transforming the healthcare to make sure that access is absolutely something that is had by everyone who is on the Medi-Cal program.
And willing to guarantee that access?
I don't know the answer to that, but I will say that access is a huge issue. We do have access monitors at the Department of Healthcare Services. Those continue to occur. They continue to listen to complaints that come in, the Department of Managed Healthcare as well.
Just listen to the complaints, but actually address them, fix
Monitor
them.
and address. That
The
is what
resources
they're
to actually
doing.
guarantee the access. That you actually, it's not just, oh, we have this many complaints, but we actually will solve those complaints so that people actually find somebody. Not paying any more than to the cheapest you can find, maybe, but they will have access.
Access is a huge priority for the administration. It's something that we're working on multiple fronts to do a better job. This is a major transformation of a healthcare system. There are a lot of changes that still need to occur. There's a lot of changes that have happened to date. But this is absolutely a work in progress and something that we continue to work hard to address and make sure that the promise of healthcare is actually delivered. That is absolutely central to the implementation of healthcare reform.
So, certainly one of the other concerns is with the elimination of, and it was federally funded, the Medicare, the Medi-Cal fee bump, which basically brought primary care to Medicare. That ended at the end of last year. So that's an 86% cut in payment to primary care physicians in the state for Medi-Cal. Middle clinics, there's some ways, through 504 other funds, and I know that there's some adjustments on the managed care payments, but, we just have to acknowledge that that's a change, so we may see new issues there. The other thing is, as we're doing the waiver, as it impacts the budget, is really trying to be more aggressive, I think, in getting federal matching funds. For example, there was a conflict between the state and the feds around school MA, so this is money that's going to go to schools. We left, I think we're trying to get closer to resolution, but that was actually about almost, $500 million in funds that got backed up for schools. All right. It was about 450 million or something. That's a lot of money, at least in my opinion. So, in fact, that could have paid for the Medi-Cal rate bump to continue that for another year. So, I think that we also need to look at these things where we could be more aggressive in trying to get more funds as we're trying to address the needs we have here. And that's so I hope that we'll be looking at that as well. And then finally, I guess the other thing is, because we're talking about retiree health and so forth, is Medi-Cal, as you may note, is 30% of the population in the state of California. It's not those people who have Medi-Cal. The state is a major payer for health care, not only in Medi-Cal, but also for employees, for retirees, for other things as well. But also to think about dynamically, when Medi-Cal underpays, and you're now 30% of the market, what cost pressures does that put on the rest of the healthcare market, including the state as a purchaser for private insurance for employees and retirees, right? As people have to cost shift between them. And so and at least on Medi-Cal, we're getting a match, roughly 50% match in traditional Medi-Cal. We will get a 90% match on the expansion population once the 100% goes away. And so is it penny-wise, pound foolish that instead of getting the federal match by raising Medi-Cal rates, where we get a federal match, instead we're paying 100% when they do the cost shift, and we're now having to negotiate rates for our employees and our retirees and so forth. And that really thinking about that in terms of how does that all come around when we look at how we spend our general fund and where we get our money and where taxpayers have to pay for. And of course, certainly the hidden tax that's on every employer who's paying for health insurance in the state. But even just selfishly for the state itself and looking at that general fund, as we're looking at retiree health and other things, how is our decisions about something like Medi-Cal now at 30% of the markets, now putting pressure and causing cost shifts where we're not getting matching funds in those cost shifts, but we get matching funds if we directly allocate it into Medi-Cal. And so we need to look at that as well. And when we look at our general fund and how we prepare for the future, because I really appreciate the governor thinking about the future, and we never know when the recession is going to hit and so forth. This is the time now to think in advance and get ahead of these things instead of falling behind.
I think you make a lot of very good points, and I think the policy of the administration has been to be very aggressive and at getting as many federal matching dollars as possible, and I think we've actually been quite successful over the last many years in doing that. But this is a constant discussion with the federal government, with the federal CMS, and as you know, the managed care organization tax rule changes that were promulgated last summer are really a sea shift. They said you can no longer charge this tax to just your Medicaid plans. It has to be a broad-based tax. So in some ways, the federal government is making some of those choices, those redistributive choices, for us in terms of how we finance Medi-Cal. And so that is an issue that we will have a lot of discussion about this year. We do have a managed care organization tax in our budget proposal. It is a broad-based tax on all eligible health plans in the state. And it's really part of our long-term vision for funding healthcare reform over the long haul. So it's going to be something we're going to have to work closely together with this committee in order to continue to bring in those additional federal monies to the state.
So I certainly hope we can think creatively, and not just out of the box, but very smartly, thinking about how do we reduce costs in the future through better organization. I mean, it's easy to just tally up, but I mean, how chronic care, disease, et cetera. And this is not just about Medi-Cal. It's also about when we talk about retiree health care costs as well. How do we help transform our healthcare delivery system in a way but realizing they're all connected. I mean, that's the part I get a little concerned about. Sometimes when we talk about budget, we don't think about how it's connected to other things and how that doing one thing here is going to cause a problem over here, even in the same budget. So thank you.
Thank you, Senator Pan. Appreciate it, in particular, your interest in making more visible the real cost to the general fund of the tax expenditures. I'm reminded of a Sacramento Bee cartoon a few years ago reflecting upon the fact that we passed them with a simple majority but repeal them with 2/3, that not unlike the Roach Motel, they go in, but they never come out.